Let's talk about China again. And China's culpability over the coronavirus pandemic has been laid out more clearly by an experienced former US State Department investigator. His efforts to trace COVID-19 origins led again to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. David Ash told our own Sharry Markson on Sunday night that despite cover-ups, information has emerged of early infections at the Wuhan Institute through their staff.
There were multiple staff members that did have to go to the hospital and appear to have had conditions of COVID-19. You don't normally go to the hospital with influenza, especially a cluster of people. So, you know, the WHO has been looking for its initial cluster of victims of COVID-19. And the point of the declassified information that the Secretary Pompeo provided was that we had information that there was indeed a cluster and that they worked on COVID-19 itself or related COVID coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is almost too much of a coincidence to believe.
Almost too much of a coincidence to believe, he was going to say. Asher also explained that the Institute's work could have been trying to develop a potential coronavirus vaccine as part of a biological warfare program.
The fact that they were funding this type of research from the military, to me, is highly indicative. But, you know, we'll have to see where the proof lies. There's going to be a need for a huge global investigation well beyond the WHO.
Yeah, lots of evidence pointing to that Wuhan Institute, some military interest, obviously, and there's nothing but stonewalling from Beijing and the World Health Organization for that matter. Let's turn to federal Liberal MP Ted O'Brien, who's an expert on China. Thanks for joining us, Ted. Does this surprise you, even though it is quite important new information with more certainty pointing to the Wuhan Institute?
Well, look, hopefully we are only days away from hearing from the World Health Organization with their scientific inquiry into what went on in Wuhan with the origination of COVID-19. But unfortunately, the reports, whether it's Xinjiang, whether it be Wuhan, whether it be Hong Kong, the concerning reports coming out are just continuous. And I think this is what happens when you have a government in the form of the People's Republic of China that is not being transparent. When you're not transparent, when you don't have information coming out publicly, then there will be a void, and that void will be created by other, whether it be NGOs, whether it be governments, whether it be academics, formulating their own conclusions, and that is why the world continues to request unfettered access. In this case, to Wuhan, in the case of the atrocities that get reported out of Xinjiang, the province of Xinjiang.
Well, I want to come to that in a moment, but before we leave the virus alone, this suggestion of a military link, of course, explains the paranoia and defensiveness of Beijing, doesn't it? Now, if they were doing some medical research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology and there was an accidental outbreak of coronavirus, that would be embarrassing, sure, but surely you would trace it and be upfront about it. But if it's linked to biological weapons, that would explain why Beijing would want to do all they could to keep a lid on it.
Indeed, and this is where the global reputation, the global standing of the People's Republic of China is now under question. If indeed you have nothing to hide, then you provide unfettered access. Once a government, regardless of their form of government, liberal democracy or a socialist government, once they do not provide unfettered access, particularly on the origination of a pandemic, then it raises eyebrows. And you can't have it both ways. You cannot say on one hand that you are a morally strong government of good standing internationally, but at the same time refuse to have international institutions like the World Health Organization do a full and complete report, access to all data. Unfortunately, you cannot have it both ways.
Ted, I wonder if we can get to the plight of the Uyghur people and what we hear about genocide in that part of China. How much do we know? How much of the information we're getting is accurate? Because it's enormously difficult to get information out of those far-flung regions of China, but so many people supposedly in detention and being killed. What do we know?
Chris, it's the same story as Wuhan. I don't think it's got to do with the fact that Xinjiang is so far away, that it is in a more remote northwestern part of China. It is the fact that the People's Republic of China's government refuses access, the unfettered access required. From the reports that are coming out, the extent of the human rights abuses are very grave. We are talking about people being locked up in detention. We are talking about forced birth control, forced labour, restrictions of freedom, restrictions of religious freedoms, to the extent that you have governments across the world, including the Canadian House of Commons, passing unanimous resolutions calling it genocide. This is serious stuff. And again, until the world has the access it needs, then it remains a vexed question. Unfortunately, the PRC refuses to have unfettered access granted, not to Australia, but to the United Nations, to the UN's Human Rights Commissioner. That person should be able to go in and should be able to check the alleged atrocities. And again, if indeed the People's Republic of China are right, if the Communist Party is right in saying there is nothing to see here, then I believe it's in their national interest to open up and to let the world see.
Thanks for joining us, Ted. I appreciate it.
Pleasure, Chris. Pleasure.
Ted O'Brien, Federal Liberal MP there, live from Canberra. Now, don't go away. After the break, there has been a development in this debate about sexual harassment and arguments flowing from the Prime Minister's